hello and welcome again to the possibly the last tutorial of the Dojo course and the last session, the last lesson on Obuda University. We will follow up with last time's controller, of course. If you can remember, we have written this contents admin controller last time. The intention here was, and still is, that we will see how to deal with content items from the code. So most of the time we interact with content items from the admin UI, but of course as a developer you should know that you can also deal with content items from your module. And the way how you do this is through the content manager. You see we have the content manager field in our controller. We use that to interact with content items. And as we have seen on one of the first tutorials, we inject an Orchard Services instance that, among others, contains the content manager. So this is the signature of the interface. Yeah, and by the way, I also see a little issue here. As you can see, Orchard Services also contains Transaction Manager. So we shouldn't inject Transaction Manager separately here. Because we can use that from Orchard Services as well. But this wasn't working last time, and actually it not only should work, but it started working later. So now I start the instance and let's see what happens. Because sometimes, for whatever reason, probably there is some caching in the background or something, IIS Express isn't picking up changes regardless of how you made them to your module. So let's open up this personalist dashboard that we have here. So it should be under the URL /Dojo Course.module/ the controller name, so that's contents admin. Oops. Contents admin / personalist dashboard. So this is just the standard MVC convention. And as you can see it here, we haven't modified anything on the code, but you can see it in the repository too. It just works. And what works here? So what we have done last time, just for quickly recapping everything. So this is the action we are looking at. First, we make an authorization. This authorization goes through the iAuthorizer service of Orchard. So you have to supply the authorizer a permission, at least, and optionally an error message. After we can see that the user is authorized, we fetch an item. So this personalist dashboard action accepts a parameter ID. As you can see, it has a default value. So if you don't supply any argument here, as we have done now, because what we see now is equivalent to this. So if you would fetch the item with the ID 0, it's the same. So we fetch an item with this ID. This get item is just for the sake of convenience our own custom method here, and this is an important aspect of how to deal with content items. So what we want to do here in this personalist dashboard, that we want to either create a new personalist. So this is our content type that we have developed last time, and probably the session before. We want to either create a new personalist if there's no ID supplied, or we want to edit an existing personalist. So that's how we do that. If the ID is 0, this is an invalid ID, so it's just a special value here. The 0, we create a new personalist. This content manager new is the instantiation of a new content item. It doesn't persist the content item, so there will be nothing saved in the database yet. That's a later step. So it just creates an on-the-fly in-memory new content item object that has the content type personalist. If there's a valid ID, we fetch the content item by the ID through this get method from the content manager. There are several ways to fetch content items through the content manager. This get by ID is the simplest one. Later today, we will see how to query content items with their different parameters. So now we have a content item. We know that if it's null, then the supplied ID was invalid because it wasn't null. So we haven't created a new content item, but it was something not null, and that ID was invalid. It doesn't have any corresponding content item in the database. Content manager returns a null then. And finally, we return a custom shape. So this method does what we commonly do with content items again. We can create the shapes of content items through the content manager too. So there are build methods. You see build display and build editor, and those are two extension methods corresponding to that. Those methods are used to build the editor or display shapes of a content item. We build the editor shape here because we want to display an editor for the content item. In one of the earlier sessions, or several of the earlier sessions, we have spoken about shapes, editor and display shapes. This is how you do it from code. And finally, we also create a custom shape. So this is something more advanced. This goes through the so-called shape factory. This is a service inside Orchard. You can access it, among others, from orchardservices.new. And this is a dynamic object, so it's quite funny how you use it. But to create an ad hoc shape that has a template somewhere, or not necessarily has, but most possibly has a template somewhere in the system, you use this new, and then like a method call, you supply a shape name. So this here is a shape name, and this whole expression says that create a new shape with this name and supply an argument to that shape that's called editor shape, and let this editor shape argument be this reference here. And we have a corresponding template to this Dojo Course _personalist dashboard shape. It's here. Is this template we have created earlier. This is a common convention that we prefix shapes with some unique value, in this case Dojo Course, because shape names are global identifiers. So if we would just call it personalist dashboard, there can be a different module having a shape with the same name, and it would clash. In this template, we basically display the editor shape. So this is the argument, this model.editor shape that we supplied to the shape here. We wrap it into a form, and it's an anti-forgery form, so it also contains a cross-site request forgery prevention token. We also have some samples of doing some common things in shape templates. This is how you display a title in Orchard. This title for page helper will also put this string in the argument into the title tag of the HTML document. This is how you create links. This is standard MVC, not just Orchard, so you have plenty of documentation regarding that. And here's another example of ad hoc shape creation. So you remember here we have in our controller this new call through the shape factory. This new property in the template is the same shape factory service, and you can create ad hoc shapes in the same way like a method call. So here we create an ad hoc shape called ad hoc example, and again there is a corresponding template. nothing fancy really, but here we have an argument too. It's called name, and this name argument is supplied to the shape with this through this parameter. So really nothing fancy. Oops, here is a T missing. So that's what we have done, and yeah, I'm removing everything I've done here, and that's what we can try out here. I will fill out the form and post the content item, and let's see what happens, because we also have a corresponding post method. So if you are managing forms, editing forms in MVC, not just in Orchard, commonly there's a pattern that you have an action where you display the form. This is the action here, and you have an action where you handle the post when the form is posted. And you commonly name the action handling the post the same as the other action, just with a suffix post. But for MVC to know that it should look for this action under the personalist dashboard name, you can use this action name attribute and the HTTP post attribute that this action expects just a HTTP post request. And here we will handle the post. So I will attach the debugger and let's see what happens. Not here, but under debug, attach the process, and we have an IS Express here. Okay, so title, my first personalist. Here are the settings, or rather the single configuration option of our content part, personalist part, that we have created a few sessions back. I don't know, maximal count should be 15, and publish now. Okay, so here is our action handling the post. Again, there's an authorization. Again, we fetch the item or create an item. Again, the same checks, and here is something new. So you remember that in getItem we just instantiated a personalist content item. This is the line here where we actually create the content item. This is where it's actually persisted in the database. We check for the ID being 0, because if the ID is not 0, then the content item is already existing, already in the database, so we shouldn't create it again. Yeah, so we create it. Here we build an editor shape again, but this time not with build editor but with update editor. Update editor is the method that ties post data to the content items data. So this method, when it runs, will tie, for example, the content of this text box to the title part's title property. This happens through the drivers, of course. So for example, for our personalist part driver, yeah, this update will happen on this line. So when update editor runs, content manager.update editor, it actually calls through multiple layers, of course, these editor methods on every content parts driver that's attached to the content item. These editor methods will be called with the updater object, and that updater object, iUpdate model object, is actually the controller. So you see we have the second argument here, because for update editor the second argument should be the iUpdate model, and since last time we have implemented this iUpdate model interface with our controller here, we can just apply the controller itself to the updater, to the update editor method, and it will serve as the updater. And through this updater, will every driver run the model binder and let the model binder bind the post data to the part object. So in this case, to our personalist part. And as you can see, update editor returns a shape So an editor shape similar to what we have built in the personalist dashboard shape result method. And this also happens by taking the return value of these editors. So what we have done here, because these contain the shapes corresponding to every part. And from these pieces, from every part's shape will be the whole editor shape built up. Yeah, so we have our editor shape now. But unfortunately we got a Stack Overflow exception, or not Stack Overflow exception, but something similar. The issue is, okay, we have a slight issue here. You see in the call stack that there's a slight issue, and by slight I mean very harsh issue with our driver. So this editor is unfortunately wrong, because this method call here is for this editor, but rather this method call should be targeted at this method. So once we modify the method call, now this method is this method call references this method. So this time everything will be alright. Yeah, this personally successfully saved is a lie, unfortunately. So let's try everything again. Okay, I will again attach the debugger, but this time to a later stage. Let's try it now that I won't fill out the title, alright? This will be an issue. Again, we have now we have the editor shape correctly. It's here. It's a dynamic object, by the way. This is how, or not entirely dynamic now, that we done with 7. This is how a shape looks, by the way, and here you can see that it also contains the content item itself, and in a dynamically generated property called content, but by the way a local zone that you can use with placement. We have spoken about local zones earlier, and in this content local zone is everything else, every other shape that's displayed in the content item, with the content item. So I haven't filled out the title, and our model state is not valid because of this. This model state contains information about the validity of the posted data. So if you have validation rules for a model, and this is again not just Orchard.MVC, if you have validation rules and some of those validation rules are not met, then the model state is valid will be false. So the validation rule that wasn't met here is that the title should be filled. So I left out the title, and actually if we take a look at title part, so the part handling the title of course, we can see that on the title there is this required attribute. So you should fill out the title, and if you don't fill it out, you will get a validation error, and in code we can check for that validation error, so the model state is valid property. So again, standard practice regarding content item creation and saving. If the model state is not valid, cancel the transaction. So this is the database transaction. I do hope you know about database transactions. Long story short, since we created the content item here, or if it was already existing on this line, we updated it. Now if the model state is not valid, we have a wrong content item in the database. So on this line, the content item is already saved in the database, but if the model state is not valid, then it contains invalid data. So to undo that save, we should cancel the transaction. Actually, there would be other ways too, but this is the most straightforward and the most and the way that always works. So if the transaction or if the model state is not valid, we just return the original. We just return the editor for the item. And since we return the editor itself, we will see that what I filled out remains in the form. This is important for the user experience. And we will get these nice validation errors together with the titles text box having a bright red border. So again, I will say something valid. This will be the second person list. Debugger is still attached, but this time I will place the breakpoint here, and let's save it now. As you can see the model state is now valid. We use the notifier to add the nice notification, and we redirect to the original action. This is also common in MVC or rather in web application development, that once you post a form, from the post target you redirect the user to some other URL. So that's here. So the user can just repeatedly hit F5 and repost the form all the time. So we redirect to the original action, and we could do a slight enhancement here. Since our person list dashboard action can also handle an ID, we can also redirect with that ID supplied. So we can fill up the route values here with an anonymous object that we have used before with route. And if we fill out the ID of the content item, and the content item's ID is under its ID property, we will be redirected to this action. Oops, so I'm saving it. But also we will get the editor of the content item that we just created, and we can modify it too. So let's see what happens. Okay, it's loaded, so let it be my third person list. The maximum count should be 15 again. Publish now. And as you can see, we were redirected to the editor of the third person list with the ID 19. So I could also edit it now and supply some different data. When I save it, it's here too. If I open up this route somewhere else, so together with this ID, again we get to the editor. And if I supply the ID 18, we get to the second person list, of course, because we have just incrementally created some content items. Yeah, so that's how you save and edit content items from code. Yeah, by the way, this create new person list is just a link for the version of this action where there's no valid ID, just a 0. By the way, here's the save and publish now button. In this case, it doesn't matter which one you choose. But remember that we have spoken about content item versioning before. It's a quite integral part of Orchard. If our person list content type would be draftable, but I think it isn't, but let's check. Yeah, it is draftable. Yeah, because it's draftable, we have the publish now button. If it wouldn't be draftable, we just have a save button. So basically, if we just click save here, so let's create a fourth person list. Oops. Yeah, and just save it now. If you go to the contents list, it's yeah, it's still published. So the issue is that on our editor we don't handle the difference between save and publish. That's unlike how the built-in editor works. So if I open up the built-in editor, we again have save and publish, but this would work. Long story short, here we create the content item. And yeah, so the issue is that so here we don't deal with versioning, because we just create the content item directly, and when we fetch it, we fetch the published content item. So basically we all the time edit the published version of a content item. We don't deal with drafts. We could also deal with drafts. So we could say that when we get this item, let's require a draft. So this would get the content item and at the same time create a corresponding draft version. So this time we would have multiple versions created when saving the content item. But this makes things a bit more complex. It's also a more advanced topic, but it's quite well documented in different sources, so we won't deal with that one now. So again, this is content item editing and saving. What we haven't seen yet is content querying. So I will just create a small action for that. It won't return anything meaningful. Actually, it could return a string, so we can see how it works. But the point here will be to demonstrate how content querying works. Again, through the content manager. So let this content item be, I don't know, person lists query. No parameters. And let's query some person lists. This happens, as mentioned, through the content manager, and the content manager has a query method. This opens up a content query. And there's also an HQL query method that you could use. It's also possible to query content items through with HQL query. HQL means it's an Hibernate query language, because nhibernate is the object relational mapping tool or library that's under Orchard. So that's a bit lower level querying. And most of the time you don't need it. You don't need its features. And it's also a bit more complex. So we will just deal with the simple content query here. Yeah, you can open a query multiple ways, but how we commonly do is using the second overload with the content type names. There are also several other overloads. Here you can also specify the version options. So if you would use this overload, then the first argument is the version options. This is also, as mentioned previously, corresponding to Orchard's versioning. Basically, all version would retrieve all the existing versions of a content item. The draft would retrieve the latest draft. Draft required would return a new draft. Latest returns just the latest version regardless of its state. And published returns only the latest published version. We will use latest, so actually this is not the default. By default, content query and every other content manager method returns the latest published version, but we will use latest now. So regardless of the content item's latest version being draft or published, it will return it. And the content name will be person list. So we will query just on person list content items. Yeah, I'm formatting the query a bit. Other arguments. Well, querying, you always end up with a method that will actually execute the query. So this line is just building the query. It doesn't execute anything. It isn't fetching anything from the database. There are two methods on content query. One is list that will actually execute the query, because this list returns an enumerable. So when we call this list, it will execute the query that was defined before and return all the matching content items. By the way, there's also another method that enumerates or that executes the query. It's called count. Count returns, of course, the count, the number of the matching content items. Oh yeah, and by the way, regarding paging, there is also a slice method. This slice is basically one method for the same reason that's made possible by link use, take, and skip methods. So basically, the first argument, skip, is how many content items you want to skip, and count is how many content items you want to fetch. We could also use that, but yeah, it's quite simple, and you can know it from other systems too. So let's just use list here for the sake of simplicity. Yeah, so this will return all the person list content items in the database. Let's just return these person lists in a comma separated list, again for the sake of simplicity. So let's use string.join for that. Let the separator be a comma, and we will return the title of the person list. So we will return the title of the person list, and for that we use this nice link expression. And at this point we have a person list content item object. But how can we get its title? There's a helper method for that. It's called as. It's kind of a casting, but it's not a real casting. If you call as with a type argument, so this time title part, it will kind of cast the content item to this part. So at this point we have a title part object, and this title part object also has a title property. We have seen that when looking at its required attribute. So now we have selected an enumeration of titles, and if I end this, we will have a comma separated list of person lists. By the way, some pro stuff. We have kind of casted our content item to title part, but if we take a look at title part, we can see that it also implements the iTitle aspect interface. What, by the way, is quite similar. It also has this title string property, but it lacks a setter. We will now just read the title. We don't want to set the title, so we could also kind of cast to iTitle aspect. So instead of title part, we could also cast to iTitle aspect. And now what's the difference? Here the difference is not apparent, but since we use an interface here, we don't tie our module to title part. We don't tie our module to the concrete implementation of iTitle aspect, because title part is one implementation of iTitle aspect, but we could have many implementations, and if we reference the interfaces when possible, then we can swap out the implementations. So we could write our custom part and implement iTitle aspect there. We could even modify our person list part to implement iTitle aspect and deal with the title somehow ourselves. And if we use the interface here, we won't have to change this code here, regardless of the implementation of Untitled aspect changing in the background. So, as a demonstration, let's use Untitled aspect, and let's open up this action and see what happens. We should wait now for some dynamic recompilation, of course, and you can see here are our present lists. We have a first page list from last time too. But let's do some more advanced content querying. There are several methods on content query. Yeah, we have seen count. For content items is a method that expects content item IDs, an enumeration of content item IDs. This is useful if you know the IDs of content items that you want to use as a beginning, and then you want to filter on those content items with content query further. Some other methods. For part actually is just similar to disgusting. So we could say for part Untitled aspect. So this would produce a with list and enumeration of Untitled aspect. So this is just casting the whole content item collection. If we remove that, then our list returns just a content item enumeration. So this is just bulk casting. We could use that instead of this link U expression. For type, we can supply for type content type names in the same way we can for query. So here you could further filter our content types. Oops. For version, in the same way filters for version. Join. Join is kind of deprecated with the latest orchard source now that we are after the so-called shift. As you may know, the shift is about mostly or for most of the time getting rid of content part records and instead storing every content part data in the so-called info set. That is an XML document that's stored together with the content item. So that's the reason why this join is kind of or will be kind of useless in the future, because this is an explicit join on a content part record. So remember that in the end this query will be translated to a database query. So it's not a surprise that we also sometimes access records, so database tables. So this join with a record would translate to an explicit join in the SQL query. So for example, since we have the person list part record here, we could do a join on person list part record. Yeah, by the way, here is how we use the info set. We have seen that 2 sessions ago. So since we store everything in the info set too, we wouldn't necessarily need a separate record for the part. Since everything is stored in the info set, we don't need part records. So we could do an explicit join with our person list part record here, but it's kind of useless. We would need this only in this case if you would access something from person list part that would need the record, because this join would prevent later lazy loading of the record. But our content part uses info set, so we don't need that. List we have seen. There's also order by and order by descending. Well, let's use order by. It also needs a record. So let's order by the title, and unfortunately since it needs a record, we are back to the implementation. So we have used the interface here, but with this line we are unfortunately tying our module to the concrete title part implementation. But unfortunately there's no real way around that. If you want to have the sorting happen in the database, what is the advised way almost all the time, because it's more efficient than fetching all the content items and doing a sorting in memory through LINQ like this. Then you need to reference the concrete implementation. And this order by needs an expression for selecting the key, so we could use the title part records title property to sort on. Some further methods. Here we have seen slice, and finally there's where. What's also an important method here. Where also needs a record, and it's a filtering expression. So we could, for example, filter on the person list part records values here. So we could say that use person list part record again we should build a predicate, and let's filter on the person list part records max count property and only display content items that have a max count property greater than 10. So I think almost every, or probably not the first one, but all the other person list content items created today will have this, will not be filtered out by this expression. So actually, the only thing that I have a record here is that we are able to filter on the content items. We can only filter on content items through the database if we have corresponding records. If we don't have corresponding records, because we are storing everything in the info set, then we can't filter. At least we can't filter through the database engine. We have to do it in memory. So if you have to filter or really query on a part's properties, then do have a corresponding record, because you can use the record just for filtering. So that's what we use here. So enough talking now, and let's see what happens. Probably I have our first page list. Yeah, that was filtered out, so we now have only today's person list content items here. And as you can see, it's indeed ordered by the title. So this works. Basically, that's content item querying. Nothing really fascinating. As you can see, it's quite similar to LINQ or any other querying. Well, of course, that's not a real surprise. You just have to think about supplying records to the content query if you want to filter or order by through the database engine. Basically, what we have seen till now is the core of a developer's knowledge when developing for Orchard. There are some further services, further pieces of the API of Orchard, but these are either less important or less complicated. So you can always learn them by themselves, by yourself. And most of the time these are either documented too, or there are plenty of examples out there. So until the end of this session, we will see some other pieces of the Orchard API that are less important, but still you will probably encounter them. So just so we wrap up the whole course, let's see them. First of all, we have this nice route here, but we have to know about the route to access this action. It would be nice if we could display a link to this route, and also to this personalist editor route, personalist editor action, actually not to the built-in action, but to the personalist dashboard action here. So it would be nice if we could display a link to this page on the dashboard. So basically what we need is a menu item in this admin menu. As commonly in Orchard, to hook into this menu, you have to write a provider, in this case a navigation provider. And by the way you write a provider is almost every time for writing a provider, almost every time you just implement an interface. In this case, iNavigation provider. So there is an interface, iNavigation provider. It's not as simple as it appears, but we'll have to implement this to hook into the admin menu. Commonly we call our admin menus admin menu. The class is implementing iNavigation provider for admin menus. So I will go on and create a new admin menu class here. By the way, our contents admin controller is in the contents feature of our module. So I will copy this Orchard feature attribute and add it to our admin menu too. So our admin menu is in the same Orchard feature as the controller it references. So let's add a new class called admin menu. Before doing anything, let's add the Orchard feature attribute. So now we should implement iNavigation provider. Yeah. We have a lot of things to do here. First of all, we need a menu name. This is easy. We should supply the menu name here that we want to hook into. And for admin menus, this is admin. So nothing really complicated till now. Oops. But we should probably also return it. Slightly more complicated is how to implement this get navigation method. We get this navigation builder object supplied here. We should use that to add our menu items, to our menu elements to the navigation. Orchard commonly uses such builder objects when in providers. So you can see here we have several add methods, so probably this will be something we need to use. By the way, we have implemented a resource manifest before for static resources. This is also a provider, and here we also have a builder. So you may notice a pattern here. Okay, so how we go on is that we reference this builder and we add something, and that something we add is probably, yeah, this overload is that we use commonly, because the second argument here is a delegate. So we commonly offload the actual menu item 3 building to another method. I'm not even sure why we do this, but it looks cool, so probably that's the reason. So actually this add method will add a menu item, and this menu item's text will be the caption argument. As you can see, it's a localized string, so we need a localizer reference here. We have seen that in action before, but we haven't used it yet from a custom class. Oh no, we have from our controller. So we have used the localizer here. We should do the same from our menu item provider. So I will add this localizer property here. From a constructor, we need to fill this T with this new localizer, just not to get a new reference exception if anything happens. And the IntelliSense is kind of broken, so I will reopen this class. Okay, so now we can add a caption to our menu item. Let this be a person list dashboard. This will be the text that's displayed with the menu item. Yeah, we could add some HTML classes. We could specify the position, for example. Oh, well, yeah, let's specify it. I don't know. It's not very important. We'll let it be 10. This position is a weight. So basically, the bigger this number here, and it can also be a fraction, of course, fraction. The bigger this number, the later will this menu item come in the navigation. So this is 10, so it will be pretty much on the bottom of the dashboard menu. Yeah. Again, we could add classes, blah blah blah. And next we will supply the delegate here. As you can see, it accepts an action, but we also supply a standard method here, and that's what I mentioned earlier, that we tend to offload this work to a separate method for the sake of coolness. So I will remove this temporarily, and this method we commonly call build menu. That should get a navigation item builder object, because this delegate in the third argument is an action, not this, is an action that also awaits a navigation item builder object. So this is build menu here. Now we have something nice looking, but still it's not really doing anything. Navigation can be hierarchical. You can have menu items and sub menu items under them. But if you would just like to have a flat menu item, so nothing underneath it, you could do it like the following. To add a target to the menu item, you can use the action method. So this will actually hook a controller action into the menu item. Action, it works pretty much the same way as HTML helpers in standard MVC. So first we need an action name. That should be person list dashboard, I think. Yeah. And the controller name, that's contents admin. Then we could supply route values. So just so we can see the whole routing in action, let's also again use such anonymous objects. Our area is our module name, so that's Dojo Course.module. And that's it. So this will add, and let's reload the page to see it in action. This will add a menu item with the caption person list dashboard with the weight 10, and also it will hook this menu item to this route, what happens to be the person list dashboard action on our contents admin controller. Yeah. I forgot to save project file, the Ctrl-Shift-S will help here, because Orchard wasn't picking up the new class, but now it should. So let's see what happens. And indeed, our present list dashboard appears here. So it works. So this was a flat menu item, but we can also have some sub-menu items. We won't go into details now, but just to see how it works, it's quite simple. So it's quite simple, but nevertheless it needs some further coding. You can basically chain such adds after each other. So now we have defined the action for this menu item, but we can also add new menu items. New menu items to this menu item with this add. So we could have a new menu item like how did we call this second action here? Person list query. Let's reference this here. So this will be person list query. And again, with this add needs a position and or an item builder delegate. So let's give it a position. That will be 1. Well, it's not really needed because it will be the only only item here. And the navigation builder. So we could again create a new method here, but let's do it inline. So let's call it item builder here, so it isn't clashing with the build menu's menu argument. And in this item builder, again, we have to specify the action. I will tab it like this, so it probably looks a bit nicer. So the action name is person list query, controller, and everything is the same here. Yeah, and we need a further parenthesis here. Yeah, you may notice the pattern. So if we would like to add a second menu item under person list query, so we could do it like this, of course. Oops. And somehow typing is not working for me. It must be the some error in the keyboard. Yeah, so by adding it like this, it would appear under person list query, but we could go further and nest the navigation further. We could call add on the return value of this action here. So here, this would add a menu item under person list query in the hierarchy, so it would be a sub menu item of person list query too. But yeah, you get the idea. First, let's see what happens now. Yeah, everything seems alright, and the dashboard is reloading. So somehow this should work. Sorry that it isn't. Yeah, probably it's a bug too. But I will take a look into this, and if I know how to solve it, it will be in the source that goes up into the repository. But anyway, the general idea of creating admin menus is through this iNavigation provider. You remember that we have also created front-end menus. These are slightly different because admin menus are generally not edited by users, while most of the time front-end menus are. So actually it's a completely different pipeline. So that's about navigation. We have the success. So let's see something completely different. And let this completely different thing be background tasks. So now we are not going according to a story or something, we are just picking pieces from the Orchard API. One further, quite simple to use, but something that's worth noting, piece of API in Orchard is background tasks. So if you want to do something with user interaction, everything is fine now. You know everything. But what if you would like to process something in the background without user interaction? Even you want to fetch something in the background, you want to process something periodically, whatever. There are many solutions to this issue in web applications. Orchard has a custom solution, and it's called background tasks. Again, we will need to implement something, and this time I background task. Now this is an interface we like because it's quite simple. There is a single method that has no arguments and has no return type, or rather it's void. If you implement this iBackground task interface, you will have a background task that's called periodically. So let's try this out. It's not related to our content, so we don't need to place it into our contents feature. We could just place it in the root feature. Let this be background task. We could have some more creative name, but this will be sufficient for now. So we have to implement iBackground task here with its single sweep method. Now the sweep method will be called every minute in the background, again without user interaction. So our background task will start to run once the Orchard shell is started. So basically when the application is started. So just as a quick thing, let's try it out without doing anything useful, just so the compiler won't optimize this method call away, and we can use the debugger. And I'm not sure if I've hit Control Shift S, but this time I have. So once dynamic compilation is done, I will attach the debugger, and we will see how our background task runs. Yeah, so let's attach to ISExpress again. Yeah, and let's see what happens. So background tasks run really every minute, every 60 seconds. This is hard-coded somewhere. You can't modify it. If you use background tasks, this is given. You have to live with it. Yeah, you can't change the frequency. This is the disadvantage of background tasks. The advantage of background tasks, however, is that they are very simple. So as you can see, it's just one method. So let's click around until we wait, but it shouldn't be more than 60 seconds. And while we are waiting, there is also a different kind of background task. Yeah, now our background task is hit, so everything is fine. As you can see, it's by the way called from the background service from somewhere inside Orchard. And by the way, we have the so-called sweep generator here, and its interval is somewhere set, somewhere from the outside set, but you can see it's 60,000 milliseconds, so 60 seconds. Yeah. So this runs as expected. Back to the other kind of background tasks. There is also something called iScheduled task. Oops. iScheduled task is sorry, not iScheduled task. Yeah, and again our background task is run, so it indeed works. I will also stop debugging. Not iScheduled task, but iScheduled task handler. iScheduled task handler is an interface for another kind of background task. To write an iSchedule task, you also have to implement an interface, this time iSchedule task handler, but it's a bit more complicated. Its process takes such a schedule task context, but in turn basically only contains this iSchedule task object, or rather an iSchedule task object. The difference is that the schedule task can really be scheduled. So you can tell the schedule task manager, by the way, because for schedule tasks it's not enough to just implement the interface, but you also have to create the task through iSchedule task manager. So once the schedule task is created, it will be scheduled for the supplied daytime. And once this daytime is hit, the schedule task handler will be called with an iSchedule task object that corresponds to the task type that we have given to create task. By renewing such scheduled tasks, you can also implement recurring background tasks that are run at arbitrary intervals, not just 60 seconds. But it's a bit more complicated, so we won't deal it now, because we have something else to look at. But it's well explained in the train demo module. So basically, the final topic now will be event handlers. Because event handlers are kind of cool inside Orchard and are not trivial to understand, because they differ from the event handlers you are probably used to in .NET. So let's see how event handlers work. What we will do, that we will fire an event from this background task here instead of just doing blah blah. For this, we will create an event handler. First, an event handler interface, and we will have several event handlers, several implementations of that interface. So let's define, or let's first of all create a new namespace called event handlers, and let the event handler interface itself be I background event handler. Yeah, it should be public. And the event handler interfaces should derive from I event handler. As you can see, I event handler is also an I dependency. It doesn't have anything in it. It's just a marker interface. But it's important that you use I event handler and not I dependency directly. We will see why. In this I background, the event handler, we can define the methods that our event handlers can hook into. Probably let's do it with just one method and call it background task run. So this will be our event. Let's write two event handlers for that event. Like, I don't know, background event handler 1 and background event handler 2, so two new classes. Both of these classes should implement I background event handler. Yeah, and here we will do some blah blah, just for the sake of being able to take a look at them in the debugger. So here are our two event handlers, identical except their names. They're both implement iBackground event handler. Now, what does this mean? We have two event handler implementations, and thus we can call into this event method, and every event handler will be run. You remember that in one of the earlier tutorials, we have written the person manager service, and in this person manager service, we have injected an enumeration of iPerson objects, and these iPerson objects are just this iPerson filter is just a simple I dependency. But by injecting an IEnumerable of this dependency, we can get an enumerable of every implementation of iPerson filter. So these two person filters were injected in that collection. Now what we'll do, that in our background task, we will just inject an iBackground event handler, not a collection, an iBackground event handler. Let it be called event handler. We also need a reference or a field for that. What is private read-only, as usually. Yeah, so we are just saving this. And in the sweep method, we will call into this event like this. Now, I hope you notice the difference. We only inject seemingly a single object here. We call a method on that single object here. But what will happen that really this method on every implementation of iBackground event handler will be called. This is the power of event handlers, or rather one of the power of event handlers. So let's recompile the site and see what happens. Yeah, it's compiled now. So let's attach the debugger. And I will place a breakpoint into both of our event handlers. So now we should just wait. So basically what you can achieve with event handlers, that one of the things you can achieve with event handlers, that you don't have to inject an enumerable of the interface, but just a single object of this interface. And in the background, Orchard will handle the rest. And it will, when you call this, it will call every implementation of iBackground event handler there that's in the system. Yeah, so our background event handler 2 is called, and our background event handler 1 is called too. So this works. However, now this is very cool, but event handlers get a bit more cooler, so to say, because with event handlers you can totally decouple your event handling logic from the place or from the code where the event is defined. So we have this interface here, and we have seen that to handle these events we have to implement this interface. But it's not necessarily, you don't necessarily have to implement this interface to handle the events. We could have a different namespace here, like decoupled event handlers. And we could write a decoupled event handler here. And we want to have an event handler similar to these event handlers. So we just copy the implementation. And now we could implement the iBackground event handler interface, but here in the event handler's namespace. But we won't do that. Instead, we will copy the interface and basically create a new interface here in our decoupled event handler namespace. So this interface here, regarding its type hierarchy, is completely independent from this original iBackground event handler. It has nothing to do with it. It's just named the same, and it has a method that has the same signature as the original event handler. But the surprise is that despite of these differences, this event handler will also run. So let's recompile the application and see what happens. Because actually, when you call into the interface, what we do, call into the event handler, what we do in our background task, yeah, and it's run. So I attach the debugger. In reality, Orchard will also call the same method on the implementations of any other interface out there that's just named the same. Now the cool thing is that this decoupled event handler namespace shouldn't be in our module. It should be in. It also could be in a different module that has no reference on our Dojo Course.module module. There is no tight coupling between these two modules, and still you could handle the events of our Dojo Course module. I think it's quite cool. Yeah, so now our background task runs, and you can see that our decoupled event handler is also run now, and our third event handler is also run. So we created a completely independent implementation, and just by naming our interface, our event handler interface the same, we can hook into the events. By the way, if the original event handler interface would also use some arguments here, or some return types that are defined here, for example, something like, I won't finish this, but just to give you an idea. Yeah, so let's imagine I have a type defined here that the event handler uses. So what to do now? Because now this decoupled event handler is invalid. This method isn't accepting any argument. So there will be some issues. And if you would copy this over to our decoupled event handler like this, we will need to reference the original myClass type. However, this is not necessary because we can just use dynamic here. We are on C# 5, .NET 4.5, so we have the dynamic runtime surface to us as developers. So we can just use dynamic here. Of course, yeah, the implementation would have to change too. Of course, here we don't have IntelliSense now on my object because it's a dynamic object. So that's the downside. But the point is that you don't have to reference the original implementation from this namespace, from this interface. Instead, you could just write dynamic. If my class would be the return type, you could just use dynamic as a return type too. So this is how event handlers work, Orchard event handlers. These are used throughout the code. So by the way, well, not iBackground tasks, but there are some services inside Orchard that also use the event handler interface. Yeah, for example, there are built-in events inside Orchard. there is something called I shall if no, then I orchard shall events. Yeah. So there is a built-in event handler interface, for example, that's called I orchard shall events. You can also implement, you could also just copy this interface over, but there wouldn't be much use of it because this event handler is built into Orchard, so you into the Orchard framework, and you always reference the Orchard framework, so you can't decouple an Orchard module from Orchard. But anyway, this is also an event handler, and by the way, these two events happen in the so-called Orchard shell's lifetime. So basically, activated will be called when the application starts, and terminating will be called when the application is torn down. By the way, since we are here, iFeature event handler is an event handler for features, module features, of course. So, for example, when we first enabled our Dojo Course module in this Orchard instance, installing and installed was called for the module with the supplied feature object containing Dojo Course.module. Enabling and enabled happens when just enabling. So installing and installed only happens once with a module. After it's enabled the first time, if you disable it and enable it again, installed won't be called, just enabling and enabled. Well, yeah, disabling and disabled is called when you disable it. Uninstalling and uninstalled would be called if there would be a module uninstall feature. There isn't. So there are services for uninstalling a module. You can also write migrations, like we have done before, for not just for the creation of the database schema, but also for dropping the database schema or even data, if you would like to, in an uninstall method in migrations. So we could write a method like this, and it would be run when the module is uninstalled. However, there is no user interface for uninstalling a module. There is no uninstall button you can press. So this would only happen if there's some code that uninstalls your module by running some lower level Orchard services. So basically this was the Dojo Course, what should only happen now is that you present your projects, and before you present it, you finish it up. As always, we are on the forum, so if you need help, just open discussions, prefixed or suffixed with Dojo Course, and we will keep an eye on them, and we will reply if we can, as soon as possible. So good luck with finishing up your project, and I hope the Dojo Course was useful for you, and thank you for your attention.